and I'm delighted in particular to have my colleague and friend Milada Vachudova from the University of North Carolina here to give this lecture. Milada's CV reads like one of those things that you read to inspire yourself to go into academia. Let me just tell you some of the places that she's had fellowships over the years. EUI, which is where Dave Andrews was for a year, our last speaker, in Florence, but also the Center for European Studies at Harvard, the European Union Center of New York City, Columbia University, Center for International Studies at Princeton University, the Belfer Center, again at Harvard, and it's had a grant from the National Science Foundation as well. So Milada did her education at Stanford and Paris, and then a DPhil at Oxford, and writes a lot on the European Union as a kind of incubator of democracy in Central and Eastern Europe, and has just published a book with Oxford University Press called Europe Undivided, and the subtitle is Democracy, Leverage, and Integration After Communism. She's going to be drawing from some of the themes of that book in her remarks today, which is called EU and US Strategies for Spreading Democracy. Milada Vachudova.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here. And I'm going to talk today, as Wade said, about US and EU strategies for spreading democracy. And I'm going to keep my comments hopefully to about 30 minutes or less because I'm very interested in your questions. So please do think of questions while I'm speaking so you can ask them. I think the place to start is on a happy note, which is that in my mind, the post-1989 transformation of Central and Eastern Europe is one of the greatest success stories of our time. And if you look back at the last 2 decades, you tend to think about the problems in world politics. And right now we certainly have, since 9/11, the abiding problem of international terrorism, which has very much preoccupied us. But one of the things which we have all concluded is that one of the ways to fight terrorism is to establish stable and secure states. Now, Afghanistan is often talked about erroneously in this manner in saying here was a failed state that harbored al-Qaeda. Afghanistan was actually not a failed state. Afghanistan was a state which was very much functioning, where the government invited al-Qaeda to operate there. But there are many other cases where we see states that have attempted to transition from authoritarianism to what we thought might have been moving towards democracy, and instead we have crippled or failed states. We also have states which seem to be moving towards democracy, but get stuck in some kind of halfway democratic situation where you have free and fair elections, or at least you have elections, but everything that goes on in between is far from what we would consider liberal democracy. So the challenge, and everyone agrees about in this, I think, in the United States and in the EU, is to build strong, secure, and democratic states. And the question then becomes, what are the best strategies? Now, I think that the post-89 success story that we have in the transformation of Central and Eastern Europe is a very interesting place for us to start in terms of trying to evaluate what kind of international intervention or international influence or international help has worked and what hasn't, and also evaluating the kind of domestic conditions which make it more possible for international influence to have a positive and successful outcome. Now, the post-89 success story was very much one of United States and West European cooperation. We had the fall of the Iron Curtain and handling the very difficult transformation of the Soviet Union from a superpower to Russia, an embattled non-superpower. And the United States and West European governments worked hand in hand to manage that transition. And it's absolutely stunning, in fact, that we managed to have the disintegration of the Soviet Union without any major bloodshed. At the same time, we had, in 1990-91, German reunification. which is again a project very much in cooperation between the US and West European governments. And we had the beginning of the democratization process in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, there are 28 post-communist states, and certainly not all of them have become successful, functioning liberal democracies with human rights and free market. But many of them have, especially the ones which have been under the influence of the EU, and I will return to that later in my talk. Now, we also have one astounding failure, which we could lay at the doorstep, particularly of Western Europe, but also the United States, and that is the violence in the former Yugoslavia. We went very quickly from having into having the greatest war in continental Europe since World War II, unprecedented numbers of casualties, and what has now been accepted as genocide against the Bosnian Muslims. So between 1991 and 1994, a whole parade of international actors, the European Union, the United States, the United Nations, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the Council of Europe, and many non-governmental organizations and governments tried to do something to stop the violence in the former Yugoslavia, and they failed. And what we had essentially was 4 years of bloodshed. And it's really interesting to think about why we had that failure, but one of the reasons was that the EU at that time did not have the tools for military intervention. So what the EU tended to prefer was ongoing negotiation. Let's just keep negotiating, because we're good at negotiating. We don't have any military power to speak of. We don't want to, and we can't decisively intervene militarily, but we definitely don't want to lose. We still want to stay involved in solving this conflict, so let's just keep negotiating. Now, the U.S. wasn't without blame in that it was very much happy to just keep negotiating. We were certainly not keen to bring in our troops, but eventually we said, no more, we need to have military intervention. And once we had military intervention against the Bosnian Serbs in the Bosnian conflict, the war was over in 8 weeks. So I like to, that is a stylized version of events, but one that gets Europeans quite riled up. However, the positive outcome of that is that if you look at the development of a common European foreign policy since the mid-90s, this failure in Yugoslavia has been very much a starting point. The sense is that we did not have the tools to take care of countries which were, an afternoon's drive from our border, and we therefore need to work harder on having a concentrated, effective, coherent foreign policy with tools. Now, they're never going to have the kind of military tools that we have in terms of intervention, but with tools so that we can act. And this is something which the United States government absolutely has had embraced, and I think is something which should be supported. Of course we want the Europeans to have a coherent foreign policy with tools so that they can take care of conflicts in their backyard. Now, if we think about strategies for spreading democracy today, the failures in Yugoslavia are very much a background to how the Europeans approach the subject. The United States also has pause to think, right? We think of ourselves now as the promoters of democracy around the world, but if you talk to anyone who studies or has lived in Latin America, the 1970s and the 1980s were about U.S. military intervention in the region, both overt and covert, and much of it was in opposition to democratically elected governments and factions. We simply didn't like the kind of people who were being elected down there. So we were not supporting democracy, we were opposing what we thought was the communist threat. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of that, but it's absolutely clear that in that case we were ideologically driven, and what was driving us was not democracy. We should allow countries to vote. Citizens should vote for parties, and those parties that win should then run the country, because if we didn't like who was elected, we tended to intervene in very brutal ways. And so just as the Europeans have a lot on in their legacy, and our legacy is direct contribution to the imprisonment, torture, and murder of tens of thousands of Latin Americans, and it's not exactly clear that that was for a cause that we would now embrace. Okay, so with this kind of common background, the US and the EU, I think, have both now learned from their mistakes and are trying to move forward with quite a different strategy of international intervention, which tries to look at how can international actors, as I said in the beginning, help build these secure, stable, and democratic states, which we all agree would improve stability in world politics. Now, there are two things, I think, which are the keys to this, and I'm going to talk about them in turn. The first is preventing democracies that are not really that are simply democracies in form but not in content, right? So countries where you have periodic elections but not the rest. And the second key is to empower local elites. We see this over and over again, that successful democratization process is when international actors work hand in hand with local elites. So let me talk about those 2 points. One of the things which I think we're learning in Iraq is that it's not just about overthrowing the regime. Overthrowing the regime has been easy. It's easy generally for the United States. It's also could be easy for a number of other international actors. The challenge isn't getting rid of the old regime. The challenge really is building a new regime which will bring stability and economic prosperity, and which won't get stuck in this gray zone. Now let me describe a few things that happen in countries that get stuck in the gray zone between authoritarianism and the kind liberal democracy. They have periodic elections, right? And maybe on the day that everybody goes to the polls, they're not intimidated. They can vote freely. But what happens in between? For example, are all political parties able to register, or is there some office somewhere that decides, well, you can register as a political party, but you can't? What about the access of opposition groups to the media? Is there someone who decides, oh, well, we like these groups, so they have access to the media, but not those? What about the way in which, not just through the media, but in other ways, that opposition groups are able to communicate with the voters? In a lot of semi-democracies, or I like the term competitive authoritarian regimes, you have registered opposition political parties, and you can vote for them. But as a citizen, you would almost never encounter their message, because their message is not in the newspapers, it's not on television, because the ruling parties control that. And so now when we see these tentative moves towards some kind of democratic elections, some kind of competitiveness in places like Saudi Arabia, this is one of the things to watch. It's one thing for the government to put parties on the list. It's quite another for these opposition parties to actually be able to have a voice in policymaking that will get to the citizens. Finally, there's the question of how much are the voters able to judge, how much information do the voters have about who they're voting for and how that will affect their personal economic and security welfare. One of the best tricks in the game if you want to win quote-unquote democratic elections, but you're basically an anti-democratic thug, is to use ethnic scapegoating. And this is extremely dangerous, right? If a politician stands up and says, you have to vote for me to protect you from that group, that ethnic minority, or that neighboring state, or that international power, or from the United States, then essentially people are scared, people don't have enough information. And if you think there's a 10% chance that they're right, that this group poses a threat, you're likely to vote for them, because if the group actually poses a threat to your existence, you don't want to take any chances. And so ethnic scapegoating, or sort of saying this election is all about protecting your well-being, your existence, is a way to sort of unite voters around a nationalist agenda without telling the voters anything about what you're going to do for them in terms of social policy, economic policy, how you're going to create jobs or make their life better. So that's extremely important. Okay, and finally, post-conflict situations. And that's something that we see in a lot of countries that are, we hope, we're nudging them towards democracy. Post-war situations create a very, very difficult arena for building liberal democracy for two reasons. First, because all of the previous elite, kind of mid-level elite, has oftentimes been driven out or demoted by the previous authoritarian regime and by the war. And by elite, I mean people like school teachers or journalists or officials who work at the city hall. These are the kinds of people who tend to have a more cosmopolitan view of the world, and they also tend to be the people who are oppressed by authoritarian regimes and who tend to flee during wartime. They're not likely to be the ones running the war. The second problem is the previous elite. What do you do with the previous elite, right? You can't simply say, now we've had regime change, and this entire elite that has been running the country, not the mid-level, but the upper-level people, are now disenfranchised. We face this problem in Eastern Europe. It was a profound and continues to be a profound problem. These countries were communist for 4 or more decades, and they had an extremely large civil service. Something like 1 in 4 people living in these countries, you could argue, was directly implicated with the way the state was run as a communist state. Well, you can't send a quarter of the population home and tell them you're now not going to have any active role in society. First of all, because the country won't run, right? These are the people who had a lot of the expertise. But second, because they then will become anti-system, right? They will then be against democracy. And so it's extremely tricky to both lure back or strengthen this kind of mid-level elite of school teachers and local officials, and also give the previous higher elite a stake in the new system. And this all goes very much into the second key point, and that is you need to give local elites an incentive to make domestic changes. You need to give, if international actors are going to have a constructive role, what they need to do is not go in and take over, at least not over the longer period of time. I mean, obviously you need to. In the case of Iraq, there has to be a very strong presence of American troops and UN troops soon. But it's all about handing power back to the locals and creating incentives for them to behave in certain ways. Not making them do it, but creating incentives. Do you understand the difference? And so here, let me tell you a little bit about the EU enlargement process and how that has worked. I think that the reason that the EU enlargement process has been so successful is that the EU didn't really necessarily even want these countries to join. In the early 90s, it wasn't that it was saying, oh, please join us. It was saying more like, we really would prefer you didn't join us, right? And you hear that now about Turkey and Ukraine. And the reason is that the EU was never designed as a promoter of democracy. The EU was not designed, hey, let's create this really great international institutions, and then other countries will want to get in, and because the other countries want to get in, we'll make them do all this stuff, you know? Kind of like a sorority or fraternity, right? You're in the club, you guys went in, hey, great. This isn't the way the EU was conceived. It was conceived to improve the economic, mostly the economic, but also the political well-being of the countries in the EU. But the interesting thing about the EU is that it's extremely beneficial to be a member, and it is extremely costly to be on the outside, especially in terms of economic growth, but also in terms of your own political power in the European context. if you're in the EU, you have a seat at the table. If you're outside of the EU, your economy is still going to have to be governed by all the rules and norms adopted within the EU, but you're not going to have a seat at that table. So what we've seen in Eastern Europe is waves of countries saying, wait, our priority is to get into the EU, and we are willing to adopt very significant domestic requirements in order to do it. And this is interesting because joining the EU, unlike any other foreign policy goal you can have, is about making huge amounts of domestic changes. Changes to how you run your economy, changes of how you set up your state. And some of these changes are very beneficial, in my view, but I'll get to that in a minute. So what we've had is some waves. First in the early 90s when the most advanced East European countries, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovenia, these countries decided our #1 agenda is to join the EU, and we're going to fulfill the requirements. And then you had another wave of countries which were, in the early 90s, stuck in this competitive authoritarianism or illiberal democracy kind of pattern, where local elites who wanted to join the EU were able to use the EU to improve their political power and eventually to win office. And now we have a whole other set of countries, some of which it's really quite surprising and amazing how well they're doing. Bulgaria, Romania, now Croatia is moving forward. And hopefully in time we'll see Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia, Macedonia, and Albania moving along the same track. At the same time, we've seen Turkey make absolutely phenomenal changes to the way its polity is run in order to qualify for EU membership. And talk about trying to get into a club that doesn't want you, right? I mean, the Turks have been getting nothing but terrible vibes from the Europeans for, 30 years now. But they're very perseverant, and now they have done amazing things in terms of improving human rights, abolishing the use of torture, improving the way the justice system runs, rights for the ethnic Kurds, free speech, freedom of assembly, women's rights. And sometimes human rights activists will say, how can you let Turkey into the EU given the conditions of the police stations in some region in the south? And my response is, well, let's think about the conditions at the police stations in those regions of the south if Turkey wasn't trying to get into the EU. Right? What would be we certainly wouldn't have the advances we've had in human rights and women's rights, and also in the economy. So it's worked amazingly well so far, but there are still a lot of challenges ahead. These countries I've talked about in the Western Balkans, Bosnia in particular, Kosovo, areas which are now more international protectorates than actually sovereign countries, have an extremely long way to go. Now, what does that say about some of the things that the United States might want to do? 3 things about this. First of all, the United States could conceivably try to use the same kinds of mechanisms that have worked with EU enlargement, but through the use of NAFTA or other international organizations. There's no reason why this model couldn't be replicated. Here's an international organization which is extremely beneficial. If you're a member, you want to be a member? That's great, but here are 10 things you have to do. And you can't just say you're going to do them, you actually have to do them, and we're going to follow up. It's possible, and in the case of NAFTA, there is generally agreement that the U.S. could have asked for more in terms of how Mexico, in particular, the quality of democracy in Mexico, which we all know is far from perfect, but also the treatment of women, the human rights, and so forth. So that's a possibility. Another possibility is, and this has already been in place for 10 years, but the U.S. has to be careful, is the U.S. trying to use the EU. And so we've had extremely consistent pressure from the United States on the EU to admit Turkey. And the Europeans get quite upset. They say, you know, for us to admit Turkey is a bit like you making Mexico the 51st state. It's not that we can just say, hey, Turkey is geopolitically very important and very important for the future of having a stable, Western-oriented Muslim country. They agree, but joining the EU is an extremely intricate process. And so think about whether or not we would be willing to have Mexico as our 51st state. But probably the next two things are the ones that I see are going to be the trend. We've been sort of away from them a little bit, but now I think we're moving towards them again. And first is realizing that the EU and the US have different strengths, and that these strengths are actually extremely compatible, right? Our strength is military intervention. We have the world's by far largest and most effective military. We have a lot of experience. We're willing to spend a lot of money on our military and on military intervention, apparently, since the Iraq conflict has been an incredibly expensive conflict, but we're willing to do that. What we seem to be less good at is some of the things which Europeans have been traditionally very good at, and that is the aftermath, rebuilding these states. Things like training police, rebuilding the judiciary and training judges, setting up local public administration, not on the national level as much as on regional and local level. These are the kinds of things, as well as peacekeeping, that the Europeans have real strengths in. And unlike us in the Western Balkans, we never wanted to send any troops to Bosnia on the ground. But the Europeans were willing to send troops and continue to be willing to send troops. So there's a real compatibility there. Of course, the Europeans don't like it particularly. They don't particularly like the idea that we do all the sort of heavy military and they just come in and clean up. And if it's presented that way, it's obviously not going to work. But the point is, you can present it a very different way in which, hey, you know, we really aren't very good at state building. In fact, we've rejected, in our time, this president has said, we don't do state building, we don't do nation building. Well, now we're trying it, but we need help, and they have a lot of resources. Another thing to think about is the role of the United Nations. And the United Nations has been much criticized. And it's true that this is an institution which has a very hard time fulfilling its mandate, because its mandate is global and extremely ambitious. And the tools it has to work with are modest. And at the same time, it's a somewhat consensus-oriented organization, and therefore it's sometimes difficult to go forward. However, if you look at peacekeeping in these failed states that the United States is so worried about in terms of preventing the spread of terrorism, the UN has had some real successes over the last 2 decades. I just made a list: Namibia, El Salvador, Cambodia, Mozambique, Eastern Slavonia, Sierra Leone, East Timor. These are all places where the United Nations sent us peacekeepers. The state has been rebuilt, and things seem to be moving forward. And what's amazing is that right now, the 11 peacekeeping operations which the United Nations has in the world cost annually less than 1 month, what we spend in 1 month in Iraq. So we tend to think of the UN as inefficient and bureaucratic nightmare, etc. But this actually, the peacekeeping, the evidence, and there's a recent report just published by the RAND Corporation, if you're interested, that you should look up on the web, actually shows that, you know, the UN is a pretty good deal for your money if what you're looking for is peacekeeping in a post-conflict situation. Okay, I will stop there and open things to questions. Where's the mic? Okay. Come on, questions.
This isn't particularly applicable to the UN or to the European Union, but the reluctance to go into Bosnia is a small particle about our reluctance to go into the Sudan and Rwanda. Mm-hmm. Do you have any comments to make about why we do not want to get involved in those genocide programs?
Well, I'm afraid my answer is extremely cynical. There are no geopolitical interests at stake in the Sudan right now. The chance of that conflict spreading exists, but it's not tremendous. And in a sense, it's just below the radar of all of the things that we have as priorities right now. The United Nations can't go into a place like Sudan without funding and a mandate, and that usually means that the United States has a veto. And I'm afraid that the United States has, although not publicly, exercised quite a bit of veto. But, it's a very tough call in some cases because, you can't expect the United States to simply be the world's policeman and go in every time there's a conflict. And so it's a very difficult balance. And sometimes the United States goes in and we get criticized, right? What are we doing, cowboys going in? And sometimes we don't go in and they're like, how come you didn't go in? How could you let this happen? And this really speaks back to the point of the importance of strengthening the UN, but also strengthening other international organizations that could play a role. So if the EU moves forward with having its own, albeit modest, military force, it could conceivably in the future intervene in a place like Rwanda, right, independently, with NATO help, but not with necessarily direct U.S. involvement. And then back.
How long do you think that the countries of the former Yugoslavia and Albania and those countries would have to get into the UN or the European Union, and what actions would they have to be taken for that?
That's a great question. And actually, this is my book that Wade told you about. So I'm hoping to write a sequel, and the sequel would be about the Western Balkans and exactly that process. My sense is that Croatia could move forward very quickly, but it's just not complying with the ICTY and with handing over war criminals. But still, what a wonderful mechanism, right? The ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, doesn't have in and of itself any power to get the locals to hand over the war criminals. But because these countries want to join the EU has made this a requirement of moving forward in the accession process. So in the case of Croatia, negotiations were supposed to begin this month. And just last week or the week before, the EU said, no, we're not going to begin negotiations until you hand over these people. My sense is that Croatia will move quite quickly and will probably join 2009 would be my guess now. Serbia, Macedonia, Montenegro could join 2012, around there. The problem is the states which are not independent states at this point, Kosovo and Bosnia-Herzegovina. And it's very difficult to see how you go from being essentially an international protectorate to being a member of the EU, where you need to be a sovereign state with your own domestic political system fighting for your interests within the framework of the EU. You need to create an independent citizens of these countries are so frustrated, right? First, they went through this horrible period of war, some of them, and all of them went through a period of incredible economic immiseration, right? Yugoslavia was one of the richest, most cosmopolitan countries. It was the richest country in the Eastern Bloc. It was the country where you'd most want to live. You had freedom of travel, etc. And to go from that to a level of economic poverty and political malaise, if it takes too long for these countries to turn around and join the EU, essentially all of their cosmopolitan elite and all of their young people who have left already for the most part, will never come back. And that is my huge concern. You know, in a place like Bosnia, you go to a town now, and the parents have come back, the parents in their 40s, 50s, 60s, but the kids are all, you know, they're here, they're in Germany, they're in Austria, they've made new lives, and those people really need to come back. And they have been coming back in places like Poland and Bulgaria because you have a prospect of things getting of having a vital economy there.
I'm wondering how much of it is picking the right place to get involved in the first place? That there are some countries where no amount of good strategy will help because the problems are too intractable. Or would you disagree with that, that if you get the strategy right, then almost any place is amenable to the promotion of democracy?
That's a very good question. I think an interesting test case now will be Liberia. Right. We have now a UN peacekeeping force in Liberia. The United States is putting a lot of money into that. And it's hard to imagine a lower point from which to start. You know, it depends on how you measure your success. I mean, in a place like Liberia, we have returned sort of food and water and so forth, right? So if that's what you're looking at, sort of re-establishing basic services to the population, intervention always works. But if you're talking about establishing a liberal democracy with, you know, a citizen participation and a strong civil society, I think you're right that there are some initial conditions which seem to be so dire that it's extremely difficult to see how outside actors can actually move things forward quickly, except for education. I mean, there's been ongoing studies that show if you start educating the population, primary education, secondary education, and the education of women, that you do seem to see benefits 30, 40 years down the line. Those studies, but obviously that's a very long, you know, and your voters aren't going to be impressed when you tell them why we're doing something. And then the other question is multi-ethnic states, right? Unfortunately, it's much harder apparently to establish functioning liberal democracy in a multi-ethnic state. And so the challenges we face in Iraq are very much that, and the challenges in Bosnia now. A lot of the success stories are countries which have been brutally cleansed of their ethnic minorities or assimilated. It just happened 100 or 200 years ago, you know, from France 200, 300 years ago, and Italy, which had amazing numbers of ethnic minorities, to countries that were homogenized more recently in World War II, right? We can talk about how great the Czechs are doing now, although they're not, and I'm Czech and I know, but the Czechs seem to be doing well, but the Jews were murdered during World War II, the Germans were expelled, the Slovaks were dumped, and the Hungarians went with the Slovaks, so now you have this little mono-ethnic state. There's a question right here. Yeah.
You spoke about incentives for disenfranchised elites. What would some of those incentives be?
You know, it's a fine line to walk between letting people from the old structures stay in and giving them incentives or a stake in the new system. In the most successful countries in Eastern Europe, such as Poland and Hungary, what essentially happened was that the previous regime elites transformed themselves, because you had democratic competitive elections, and in order to win the elections they decided they would have to change, and so they renamed themselves from communists to social democrats. They changed their agenda from you know, being pro-Moscow and anti-German and anti-US to being pro-NATO and pro-EU. In fact, the Hungarian communists were accused of exchanging the servitude of Moscow for the servitude of Brussels. But that was the best outcome, in the sense that you didn't say to these people, you now have no right to hold public office, you're being completely marginalized for the next 10 years. It was actually that they transformed themselves to get back into the political game. But in Czech Republic, for example, in other countries, you have rules that say if you worked for the secret police, okay, if you worked for the organs of repression, then you are excluded from public life. But if you worked in other aspects, you know, the Ministry for Trade or the museum or a professor at the university, there are no such rules, and that seems to be the only way forward in most cases. I think the bottom line is the best way to get these elites on board is to not pay too much attention with what they did before regime change. And that is a kind of horrific thing to contemplate in a place like Iraq, where you have, such horrible crimes against Iraq's own citizens. And obviously there's some people that need to be put in a separate category. But in general, that is the lesson. Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, my question is, you talked earlier about dealing with a lot of the former Yugoslavia, where they're pretty much international protectorates and such like that. How would perhaps the example of Cyprus and that entering the EU serve as perhaps a model for bringing those in, or are these really two separate cases that really can't be compared?
Well, I think that Cyprus is the greatest failure of the EU to use EU leverage to solve a problem it could have solved. I mean, the EU basically could have said, we're not letting y'all in until you sort this out. And instead, because of the pressure of the Greeks, who have in their time been the greatest miscreants of European foreign policy, basically said, Greek Cyprus comes in no matter what. And then the nasty, anti-democratic, thuggish leadership in Greek Cyprus essentially told the voters to vote no against reunifying the island, because they had nothing to lose and everything to gain. Their entire political power base has been based on a divided Cyprus over the last many decades. And a united Cyprus would completely change the political game and probably mean that they would lose power, the established parties. So they had absolutely no incentive. So this is a case where I think the EU should have used its leverage and been much, much harsher. But obviously the Greeks stood in the way. The problem, of course, between that and a place like Kosovo, the EU did just that to Serbia and Montenegro. It said, you guys want to separate? No, not now. We will not allow it. And they signed an agreement and they haven't separated, although there are signs they will soon. So yes, you can do things like that. The problem is that at some point you have a reaction against that kind of heavy-handed, you do this now. And it's extremely hard line to walk. You don't want to basically be ordering, you don't want to have too of a heavy hand in terms of telling people where the borders of their state are or not, because then it's an imposed solution from the outside, which might lead to conflict in the future. So ideally the solutions would come more from the inside. Yes.
I just have a question in regards to the formation of the EU. I've noticed in a lot of the world conflicts lately, there have been times where the US and the EU have sort of disagreed on a lot of things. And is there a chance that in the future, based upon these disagreements, knowing that these two countries are becoming so powerful in regards to other countries, that it would cause a problem such as happened with, say, like Russia during the Cold War? That, I mean, I know we're more similar than that, but what kind of a threat is there for that in the future?
I think that's a very good question, and I think the answer is that we are astoundingly similar. The thing that is actually most different about us is the way we run our economy, right? They have a social democratic background where you have much greater state intervention, and you basically have welfare states in Western Europe, and we don't have that. And that doesn't really matter in terms of foreign policy, right? The fact that they have national health care and we don't, or the fact that they have much higher benefits for social policy than we do, it shouldn't matter and has never mattered. In terms of other things, our disagreements, I think, over the last 4 to 8 years have been incredibly superficial and quite silly. I mean, and I lay blame on both sides. The whole Chirac versus Bush, what was that about? Nothing, we basically have the same goals and the same interests in terms of world stability, spreading democracy, stabilizing states, fighting terrorism. And a lot of this comes down to a question of semantics. And I'm afraid that the U.S. news, I was actually taking a shuttle from the airport last night, and I told the driver what I was doing my lecture on today. And he said, isn't European foreign policy just about opposing the United States? Well, you know, if you actually look under the layers of rhetoric, our foreign policy ambitions are so similar. And so I think it's extremely unfortunate that on this question of Iraq, we managed to dig ourselves in these two opposing camps. I mean, there was a real serious disagreement there about what to do and how to do it. But that disagreement does not, in my mind, speak to a huge chasm between us in terms of future similar conflicts. I can very easily imagine the next kind of Iraq conflict coming along that we would agree. But here I will say that the style of this administration has made it extremely difficult for the Europeans to do what they have to do, which is be the sort of junior partner to the United States. And prior administrations have been better. I mean, Bush Sr. was beautiful on this, right? The Cold War ended, and Bush Sr. managed to make the Soviet Union feel good, even though it was falling apart, managed to make the Europeans feel good, even though their entire sort of geopolitical architecture was in transition. So.